The closing of a door can be a quiet thing. For 18-year-old Ilara, it was the sound of the world ending. The heavy oak of her father's smithy, a door she had passed through every day of her life, shut with a final, oiled click. On the other side stood Mr. Gable, the town councilman and merchant, his face a mask of grim propriety. He did not meet her eye. He had just finished explaining, in the calm and reasoned tones of a man who held all the power, that her father's debts had consumed everything, the smithy, the house, the tools, still warm from her father's hands. All of it now belonged to the town of Providence, to be sold to settle accounts. He pressed a few coins into her palm. The metal was cold and felt impossibly light. "This is what remains," he said, his voice devoid of pity. "It is more than fair." Beside her, Ilara's mother, Eleanor, coughed, a dry, rattling sound that shook her frail frame. The mountain winter was already settling in her lungs, a thief stealing what little strength she had left. Ilara looked from the coins to her mother's pale face, then back at the closed door. It was October. The wind already had teeth. What she had left could be counted in moments: 3 silver dollars and a handful of copper cents. The heavy sheepskin-lined coat her father had worn, which now hung on her own small shoulders. A single, perfectly balanced felling axe, its handle worn smooth by a better man's grip. The clothes on her back. Her mother. And a deed, a piece of yellowed paper, Gable had pushed at her as a final, worthless gesture. It granted her title to a plot of land 2 miles up the mountain, a place the townsfolk had a name for. They called it the Scab. It was a joke of a property, a patch of barren, wind-blasted rock on the north face of the ridge, useless for grazing, impossible for farming. Her father had won it in a card game years ago and had never once bothered to walk its boundaries. It was nothing, less than nothing. It was an insult wrapped in legal paper. The community of Providence watched them from behind curtained windows and from the doorways of their shops. They saw a girl, barely a woman, standing with her sick mother in the middle of the street, the sum of their lives reduced to what they could carry. There was pity, yes, but it was a thin, useless thing. It was the pity one feels for a lamb staked out for wolves. Several people offered advice. Mrs. Gable, the merchant's wife, suggested the poorhouse over in Silver Creek County. "They are good people," she said, not seeing the fire that flashed in Ilara's eyes. "Eleanor will be warm there." Another man, a trapper named Brant, whose axe Ilara's father had often mended for free, spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "Head east, girl. Nothing for you here. That mountain will eat you alive before the first real snow." He looked at the deed in her hand and laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Gable give you the Scab? That's cold, even for him." Ilara listened to them all, her face as still and hard as the granite peaks above them. She looked at her mother, who was shivering now, leaning against her for support. The poorhouse meant separation. It meant charity. It meant defeat. Heading east meant abandoning the only home she had ever known, to die among strangers on the road. She felt the smooth wood of the axe handle under her calloused fingers. She looked up toward the mountain. She made a choice. It was a quiet, desperate decision made in the heart of a girl who had nothing left to lose. She turned her back on the murmuring crowd and walked not east, not toward Silver Creek, but to Gable's Mercantile. The bell above the door chimed, a sound that had always meant candy or new ribbons. Now it sounded like a funeral toll. Mr. Gable looked up, surprised to see her. She placed her coins on the counter. The silver dollars rang with a defiant clarity. "I need a shovel," she said, her voice low but steady, "and a pick, a bag of salt, and 20 pounds of seed potatoes." Gable raised an eyebrow. He began to speak, to offer more sensible, condescending advice, but something in her expression stopped him. It was the look of a trapped animal that had decided to stop running and start chewing through its own leg. He took her money in silence. She walked out of the store with the tools over one shoulder and the heavy sacks in her arms. She did not look back. She put one arm around her mother's waist, and together they turned away from the town of Providence. They began the long, slow walk up the winding trail toward the worthless piece of land where everyone knew they would die. The journey was a punishing ordeal. The path was steep and riddled with loose rock. Every step was a battle against gravity and the biting wind that funneled down from the high peaks. Ilara had strapped the shovel and pick to her back, the weight driving the straps deep into her shoulders. In her arms she cradled the sack of potatoes like a swaddled infant. Her mother leaned on her heavily, each breath a painful, shallow gasp. The air grew thinner, colder. The cheerful green of the valley floor gave way to stunted pines and gray, lichen-covered stone. The world became a study in endurance, a litany of aching muscles and burning lungs. They reached the scab just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the western ridge, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. Ilara felt her heart sink into a cold, dark place. The town's mockery had been an understatement. It was worse than she had imagined. The land was a tilted plate of stone, nearly devoid of soil, ending abruptly at a sheer rock face. A few skeletal trees clung to life in the crevices, their branches permanently bent and twisted by the relentless wind. And there, in the center of the rock wall, was the feature that gave the place its name, a shallow, ugly fissure, a collapsed scar in the stone, filled with rubble and dead leaves. It looked like a grave that had been dug and then abandoned. Eleanor sagged against her, her coughing fit so violent it brought her to her knees. Ilara knelt beside her, pulling the heavy coat tighter around her mother's shoulders. The wind howled around them, a mournful, predatory sound. This was it. This was her inheritance, a hole in a rock on a windswept mountain. For a long, terrible moment, Ilara believed the town was right. She had brought her mother here to die. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, stealing the air from her lungs. Tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall. But her father had not raised a daughter to surrender. He had taught her that the finest steel is forged in the hottest fire, that strength is proven not when things are easy, but when they break. She got to her feet, her jaw set. She would not be beaten by a pile of rocks. She helped her mother to a relatively sheltered spot at the base of the cliff, wrapped her in their only blanket, and then turned to face the fissure. With the last of the daylight, she began to pull at the loose stones, her bare hands quickly growing numb and raw. She worked until her fingers were bleeding, clearing the entrance of the collapsed rock. The fissure was not deep, perhaps only 10 feet, ending in a solid wall of darker, denser stone. It was a pathetic, useless alcove. A failure. As she slumped against the back wall, utterly defeated, she felt it. At first, she thought it was her imagination, the warmth of her own exhausted body. But it wasn't. The rock behind her was not warm, precisely, but it was distinctly not cold. While the air in the alcove was frigid, the stone itself held a faint, deep, and impossibly steady neutrality. It was like leaning against a sleeping animal. Her breath hitched. She pressed her cheek against the stone, then her whole hand. There was no doubt. A deep, geothermal warmth bled from the very heart of the mountain, and then she heard it. Over the scream of the wind, a tiny rhythmic sound. Drip, drip, drip. She followed the sound with her fingers, tracing a damp line in the rock to a small, dark crack near the floor. From it, a single drop of water emerged, clear and perfect, before falling into a tiny puddle below. It was a spring, a hidden, protected, year-round source of clean water. In that moment, the despair did not just vanish, it was burned away by a surge of fierce, defiant hope. The scab was not a grave, it was a gift. The town saw a worthless hole. Her father, in some unknowable act of gambler's providence, had given her a fortress. The stone would be her walls, the mountain's own heat would be her hearth, the hidden spring would be her well. They had cast her out, left her for dead. But Ilara knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she would not just survive here. She would build. The next day the labor began. It was not work. It was a war waged against the mountain itself. Ilara's tools were her weapons, the pick to shatter, the shovel to clear, the axe to shape. She started at the back of the shallow fissure, where the geothermal warmth was strongest. The rock was dense basalt, and it fought her for every inch. She would swing the heavy pick until her arms screamed with fire, until the muscles in her back and shoulders knotted into ropes of agony. The shock of each blow traveled up the handle and into her bones. Small chips would fly off, sometimes striking her face, leaving small bleeding cuts. Then she would drop the pick and use the shovel, scraping the debris into a pile near the entrance. Her hands, accustomed to the smithy but not to this relentless grinding toil, were destroyed in the first 2 days. Blisters formed, broke, and bled, leaving weeping patches of raw flesh. She tore strips from the hem of her spare dress and wrapped them tightly around her palms, but the rough work wore through the fabric in hours. Soon her hands were covered in a permanent layer of grime, blood, and dirt that served as a kind of second skin. She learned to ignore the pain, to push past the exhaustion, until it became a numb, humming presence in her body. Slowly, impossibly, the cave deepened. What had been a 10-foot alcove became a 15-foot chamber, then 20. She was not just digging, she was sculpting, following the seams in the rock, using leverage and clever strikes to break off larger chunks. Every evening she would stumble out of the deepening darkness, her body a single, throbbing ache, to build a small fire for her mother, boil some water, and roast a few of the precious seed potatoes. Eleanor watched her, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and terror. She was too weak to help, her presence a constant, fragile reminder of why Ilara could not stop. The excavated rock became the raw material for her next project. She began to build a front wall enclosing the entrance to the cave. She sorted the stones by size, hauling the largest ones to form a thick, solid foundation. She used the smaller rocks to fill the gaps, creating a wall that was nearly 4 feet thick at its base. For mortar, she found a deposit of dense clay near the spring's runoff. She mixed it with water and dried grass, packing it into every crevice. It was slow, back-breaking work, lifting and setting each stone, her whole body straining with the effort. For the roof over the entryway she needed wood. She turned to the stunted pines clinging to the hillside. Felling them with her father's axe was the one task that felt familiar. The rhythm of the swing, a comforting memory. But dragging the logs up the slope to her building site was another brutal test of her endurance. She laid them across the top of her stone walls, creating a sturdy frame. Then she spent days hauling soil and sod from a sheltered patch lower down the mountain, laying it thick over the logs. The result was a living roof, an extension of the hillside itself, that would insulate and practically disappear into the landscape. As the structure took shape, so did her systems for survival. The most crucial was heat. She identified a natural vertical fissure in the ceiling at the very back of the main chamber. It was a chimney waiting to be born. She spent a week on a rickety scaffold of her own making, painstakingly widening the crack with a hammer and a sharpened metal rod. Below it, she built a massive hearth and fireplace from the smoothest, flattest stones she had excavated. The logic was simple and profound. The fire would heat the stone of the fireplace, and the fireplace would radiate that heat into the dense rock walls of the cave itself. The entire mountain would become her thermal battery, absorbing the heat and releasing it slowly, steadily, long after the fire had banked to embers. Water was the easiest system. She had her spring, her miraculous, constant drip. She spent 2 days carefully carving the stone floor beneath it, chipping away a shallow channel that led to a larger, bowl-shaped depression. This became her cistern, a permanent reservoir of clean, cold water, safe from the freezing air and any contamination. She lined it with a thin layer of the slickest clay to ensure it held every precious drop. No more hauling buckets, no more melting snow. Water was simply there, a gift from the rock. For food, she had a radical idea, born of the cave's unique properties. In the main chamber, not far from the hearth where the geothermal warmth was most pronounced, she built 3 long, shallow boxes from leftover pine slabs. Then began the most arduous task of all, filling them with soil. She had to haul it all, sack by sack, from the meadow a quarter-mile below. It took weeks. Into this rich, dark earth, shielded from the killing frosts, and warmed from below by the mountain and from the side by her fire, she planted the rest of her seed potatoes, along with a few hardy greens grown from seeds she found in a forgotten pocket of her father's coat. A subterranean garden, a secret harvest growing in the dead of winter. With the basic shelter dug and the primary systems in place, she knew she needed more. She needed a source of protein and fat that didn't rely on traps or luck. She needed livestock. Taking the few remaining coins she had saved, she made the long trek back down to Providence. The town was a shock to her senses after the solitude of the mountain. The smells, the sounds, the people, it all felt alien. Her appearance caused a stir. She was thinner, harder, her face smudged with dirt, and her hands wrapped in stained rags. She walked with a new purpose that unsettled them. In Gable's Mercantile, the whispers stopped as she entered. Mr. Gable looked her over, a flicker of something. Was it surprise? Respect? In his eyes, before his customary sneer replaced it. "Still playing in the dirt up on the scab, are we, Miss Ilara?" he asked, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. Ilara met his gaze and felt nothing. His opinion was wind on stone. "I need 2 nanny goats and all the chickens you'll sell me for this," she said, placing her last silver on the counter. The purchase was absurd. A girl with no pasture, no barn, no visible means of feeding animals was buying livestock on the cusp of winter. The transaction was completed in a charged silence. The town watched as she led her small, noisy flock out of town and back up the mountain trail. The sight solidified her legend. She was no longer just a foolish girl. She was the Whole Witch, a creature of the mountain, clearly mad. She built an enclosure for the animals in a secondary chamber she had started to dig off the main room. It was small but secure, walled with stone and warmed by proximity to the main hearth. The goats would give milk, which meant cheese and butter. The chickens, if she could keep them alive, would give eggs. They were another living, breathing part of her interconnected system of survival. A week after she returned with the animals, she found him, a scrawny black dog with one floppy ear and ribs showing through its mangy coat, huddled near the entrance of her cave, drawn by the smell of goat and the faint whisper of warmth escaping from the heavy wooden door she had built. He growled, but it was a weak, fearful sound. She left out a bowl of goat's milk. He drank it greedily. She did it again the next day. On the 3rd day, he followed her inside. She named him Cinder. He became her shadow, her guard, her tireless companion. In the deep, silent solitude of her stone world, his warm presence at her feet was a comfort beyond measure. Her mother had the warmth of the fire, and Ilara now had the warmth of a loyal friend. The story of Ilara's folly ripened in Providence as the weather turned. The tale of the girl who bought goats to live in a hole became a staple of gossip at the Mercantile and after Sunday service. The nickname, the Whole Witch, stuck, a casual cruelty that defined her in the town's imagination. She was the local cautionary tale, a symbol of stubborn foolishness. Children were warned that if they didn't behave, the Whole Witch of the Scab would come for them. Brant, the trapper, made it a point to pass by her settlement while checking his lines. He stood a ways off watching her haul stones and laughed so the whole valley could hear. "You'll be buried in that hole come the first snow," he shouted, his voice dripping with scorn. "That rock will be your tombstone." Alara didn't look up. She simply hefted another rock and set it in place on her wall. His words were meaningless. The wall was real. As autumn bled into winter, the world outside her shelter shrank. The first snows came, dusting the peaks, then blanketing the valley. Soon the landscape was an endless, undulating sea of white. For the people in Providence, this was the season of hunkering down, of rationing wood, of hoping their roofs held. For Ilara, it was a time of quiet, rhythmic work. Her world became the circle of light and warmth cast by her fire. Her days fell into a simple, life-sustaining routine. She would wake in the deep, silent dark of the cave, the only light the glowing embers in the hearth. Cinder would stretch at her feet. Her first task was always the fire, adding logs she had painstakingly cut and stacked against the inner wall, a bulwark of fuel to last the winter. The fire was the heart of her world. If it died, they all died. As the flames grew, they would cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, making the cave feel alive. Then she would tend the animals. The goats, snug in their stone pen, would greet her with soft bleats. She would milk them by lantern light, the warm, fresh milk steaming in the cold air. She would check on the chickens, collecting the miraculous, perfect eggs they laid in their nesting boxes. These were not just chores, they were rituals of gratitude. Every egg, every cup of milk, was a victory against the hostile world outside. Section. Next came the garden. In the dim, steady warmth of the cave, her subterranean plants were thriving. The potato vines grew thick and green, and the hardy lettuces and kale were a vibrant shock of life against the gray stone. She watered them from the cistern, her fingers tracing the leaves as if they were the most precious jewels. The smell of damp earth was a constant, welcome presence, a reminder of life in a season of death. Her mother Eleanor was her constant companion. The brutal mountain air had been replaced by the steady, gentle warmth of the cave. Her cough had eased, the rattling in her chest quieting. She was still frail, but she was stable. Alara would read to her from the one book they owned, an old almanac, or they would simply sit in comfortable silence, listening to the fire crackle and the wind moan high above them. In this small, warm world she had carved from the rock, Ilara was not just surviving, she was keeping her mother alive. She was utterly alone, miles from any other soul, but she was not lonely. She was the sovereign of her small, ordered kingdom of stone and fire. Her systems faced smaller tests before the great one. A pack of wolves, lean and desperate with hunger, caught the scent of the goats. They circled the shelter one night, their howls echoing off the rock face. Cinder erupted into a frenzy of ferocious barking, and Alara stood by the door, her father's axe in hand, her heart pounding. But the wolves could find no purchase, no way in. The thick stone walls and the heavy barred door were impenetrable. They eventually gave up, their frustrated cries fading into the darkness. Her shelter had held. Another test came from the weather itself. An early wet blizzard dropped 2 feet of heavy, saturated snow in a single night. The weight was too much for the sod roof over the entrance, and a section near the front wall began to sag dangerously. Water started to drip through. For 2 days, in the heart of the storm, Ilara worked to fix it. She shored up the log beams from inside and then ventured out into the blinding snow to clear the roof and reinforce it with more stones. It was brutal, freezing work, but she learned a valuable lesson about load-bearing and drainage. She adapted, she overcame. Each small victory hardened her resolve and deepened her trust in what she had built. Then came the storm that would be known for a generation as the Great Blizzard of '83. It did not arrive like other storms. It came like an invading army, announced by a sky the color of a bruise and a silence that was heavy and absolute. Then the wind began, a low moan that grew into a piercing, relentless shriek. It was a physical presence, a thing with claws and teeth that tore at the world. The snow did not fall, it flew horizontally, a blinding white torrent that erased the landscape, burying everything in its path. The temperature plummeted. It fell past 0, past 10 below, past 20. It finally settled at a staggering 38 degrees below zero, a cold so profound it felt like the end of the world. It was a dry, consuming cold that froze breath in the air and made exposed wood crack with a sound like a pistol shot. The world outside became an alien planet, hostile to all life. In Providence, the community's confidence shattered like brittle ice. Their well-built wooden houses, which had felt so sturdy and safe, were revealed to be fragile shells. The wind forced its way through every crack, every chink in the walls. The cold was a physical invader, a knife that could not be stopped. Families huddled around their fireplaces, burning through their wood piles at an alarming rate. But the intense cold created a thermal inversion, and smoke, unable to rise, backed up in chimneys, filling houses with a blinding, choking haze. Roofs, built for normal snowfalls, groaned under the immense, unexpected weight. The meeting hall's roof was the first to go, collapsing with a great roar that was swallowed by the storm. Livestock, even those sheltered in barns, began to die, their bodies freezing solid in their stalls. The town's main woodpile, their emergency reserve, was buried under a 15-foot drift, as inaccessible as if it were on the moon. Wells froze over. Food supplies dwindled. The safe, ordered world of Providence was collapsing, and its people were trapped, freezing, and terrified. Mr. Gable, in his fine, large house, sat with his family wrapped in every blanket they owned, watching his breath plume in his own living room, the cold seeping through the walls like a ghost. But 2 miles up the mountain, inside the earth, it was another world entirely. Ilara heard the storm, but it was a distant thing, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the stone. The wind could not get a purchase on her low, earth-covered shelter. It simply screamed over the top of the hill and was gone. Inside her cave, it was calm. The great stone hearth radiated a deep, penetrating warmth. The walls, having absorbed the heat for weeks, now gave it back in a gentle, steady wave. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke, roasting potatoes, and damp earth. The goats were peaceful in their pen, the chickens huddled, alive and well. The water in her stone cistern was cold, but it flowed freely, untouched by the impossible freeze outside. Ilara moved through her home with a quiet confidence. She stoked the fire, milked the goats, checked on her mother, who was sleeping peacefully, cocooned in warmth. She was not fighting the storm. She was outside its reach. The systems she had built through pain and relentless labor were working perfectly. The town had called her a fool for digging a hole, but her hole was a sanctuary, while their sturdy houses had become tombs of ice. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, when the storm was at its most violent and the world was a roaring vortex of white, a new sound broke through the moan of the wind. It was a frantic, desperate banging on her heavy wooden door. Cinder launched himself forward, a volley of deep barks echoing in the cave. Ilara grabbed the axe, her heart hammering in her chest. No animal could make that sound. It was human. She pulled back the heavy bar and cracked open the door. A figure, completely encased in snow and ice, fell forward into the room, collapsing onto the stone floor. It was Brant, the trapper, the man who had laughed at her. His face, visible through a mask of frozen beard and snow, was a canvas of terror and desperation. He was half frozen, his words coming in ragged, breathless gasps. "Help! Please," he choked out, his body racked with shivers. "My boy, he's sick. The fever. Our cabin. It's as cold inside as out. No more wood. We're dying." Ilara stared down at him. The memory of his mocking laughter, the sting of his cruel words, "That rock will be your tombstone," flashed through her mind. A bitter, cold anger rose within her. Here was the man who had scorned her, now begging at her feet. She looked at her woodpile, so carefully rationed. She thought of her food stores, measured to last until spring. Helping him, helping his family, meant risking her own delicate balance of survival. It meant sharing her precious, life-sustaining resources with someone who had wished for her demise. But then she looked at his face, stripped of all its arrogance, leaving only the raw fear of a father for his child. She thought of a small boy, burning with fever in a cabin as cold as a grave. The choice was not a choice at all. Her father had taught her to mend what was broken, whether it was steel or a human life. To turn him away was to become as cold and unforgiving as the storm itself. She said nothing. She simply closed the door, shutting out the screaming wind, and helped the shivering man to a bench near the fire. She gave him a ladle of hot soup, and while he drank, she acted. She did not just give him firewood. She went to a small sled she had built from pine runners and began to load it. She piled it with dry, split logs. She took several smooth, flat stones from the hearth, so hot they shimmered in the air, and wrapped them in thick cloth. She filled a sealed jug with fresh goat's milk and packed a bundle of roasted potatoes and preserved greens. Brant watched her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What? What are you doing?" he stammered. "You're coming with me," she said, her voice calm and firm. She pulled on her father's heavy coat, wrapped her face in a scarf, and whistled for Cinder. The dog, sensing the urgency, was instantly at her side. Together, the three of them plunged back out into the heart of the blizzard, Ilara leaning into the wind, pulling the sled that carried a cargo of impossible hope. The journey to his cabin was a nightmare, a brutal fight for every step against a wall of wind and blinding snow. Cinder, his senses unerring, led the way. When they finally reached the trapper's cabin, the scene inside was one of utter despair. Brant's wife was huddled over their small son, trying to warm him with her own body, but both were shivering violently. The boy's breathing was shallow, his face flushed with fever. The air was dangerously cold. Without a word, Ilara went to work. She showed them how to place the hot, wrapped stones around the child, creating a pocket of intense, life-giving heat under the blankets. She helped Brant get a fire started with the dry wood she had brought. As warmth slowly began to seep back into the tiny, frozen room, she heated the goat's milk and helped the mother coax some of it into the sick boy. She had not come just to give charity, she had come to rescue them. After the storm's fury broke, though the cold remained, a delegation from Providence made its way up the mountain. Brant had returned, not just with a story of survival, but with a gospel of salvation. He led the small, desperate party, which included Mr. Gable himself, his face gaunt and his pride stripped away by 3 days of freezing terror. When Ilara opened her door to them, they stopped, stunned into silence. The warmth that flowed out of the cave was the first thing that hit them. It was not the scorching, temporary heat of a desperate fire, but a deep, radiant warmth that felt like life itself. They stepped inside, their eyes wide with disbelief. They saw the neat stacks of firewood, the calm, healthy animals in their pen, the light of the fire dancing on smooth stone walls. And then they saw the garden. In the dead of a world frozen solid, they stared at rows of vibrant green plants growing from the earth. It was a miracle. It was impossible. They saw her mother, Eleanor, propped up on a cot near the fire, weak, yes, but alive and breathing easily. They could not reconcile this scene of ordered, thriving life with the stories they had told themselves about the foolish girl in her hole, the Hole Witch. The reality of what she had built, with her own 2 hands, in the face of their ridicule and dismissal, was a blow more powerful than the storm. Mr. Gable, the man who had cast her out, who had sealed her fate with the click of a door, walked forward. He looked at the stone walls, at the cistern, at the hearth. He looked at Ilara, standing there not with triumph in her eyes, but with a quiet, solid strength he had never seen in any man. His face, which had been a mask of authority for so long, crumpled. The words came out as a broken whisper. "We were wrong," he said, the admission tearing through his pride. "My God, child, we called you a fool." He looked around the warm, life-filled sanctuary, and then back at her. "We were the fools." Ilara looked at the humbled faces of the people who had scorned her. She saw their shame, their desperation, their awe. There was no victory in her heart, only a deep, quiet weariness and a sense of profound duty. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not list their sins against her. Her triumph was not in their defeat, but in her ability to offer grace. She simply gestured to an empty bench near the fire. "There is soup," she said, her voice even. "The children should come in first. There is room." And they came. She opened her home, her sanctuary built from their rejection, and she saved them. She fed them her food, warmed them with her fire, and offered them shelter from the storm they had not been wise enough to face. In her quiet act of generosity, her vindication was absolute. When the great blizzard of '83 finally receded, it left behind a changed world. The town of Providence was devastated, its sense of security shattered. But its people had not all perished. A core of them, the ones who had made the desperate trek up the mountain, had survived. They owed their lives to the young woman they had dismissed as a mad fool. The name, the Whole Witch, was never spoken again in the valley. If it was with a tone of reverence and shame. Instead, they began to call her home the Hearthstone, for the fire that had saved them, or simply the Rock, in honor of its unyielding strength. The people of Providence no longer came to her with pity, but with a deep and abiding respect. They came with sacks of flour and tools to trade for her advice. They asked her how to build with stone, how to find the warm places in the earth, how to read the signs of a coming winter. Mr. Gable, his authority gone, publicly resigned from the town council, a quiet admission of his failure in leadership and in character. The rebuilding of Providence was done differently. The lessons learned in Ilara's cave were taken to heart. New homes were constructed with deep stone foundations. Root cellars were dug not just for storage, but as emergency shelters, mimicking her design. People began to build with an eye toward the mountain's harsh realities, not just their own prideful assumptions. The entire architecture of the community's survival changed, guided by her example. The worthless plot of land, known as the Scab, became the most important landmark in the region, a testament to ingenuity and resilience. Years passed. The mountain remained, and the seasons turned. Ilara's mother, Eleanor, eventually passed away, not in a cold poorhouse among strangers, but peacefully, in the deep warmth of the home her daughter had dug from the earth for her. Ilara remained at the hearthstone, no longer an outcast, but the quiet, unshakable center of the community she had saved. Her story traveled, carried by merchants and trappers to other towns, becoming a frontier legend, the tale of the woman who listened to the stone and built a life where none was thought possible. One clear autumn evening, Ilara stood at the entrance of her home, Cinder's aged gray muzzle resting on her hand. She looked down at the lights of Providence twinkling in the valley below. The town was scarred but stronger, wiser for what it had endured. She felt the faint, constant warmth seeping from the rock at her back, a familiar and comforting presence. She had not set out to prove a town wrong. She had not dug and bled and toiled for vengeance or for vindication. She had done it all for the simple, fierce love of a daughter for her mother. She had built a shelter to save one life, and in doing so had discovered the blueprint for saving them all. True strength, she now knew, was not found in what the world gave you, but in what you could build when it gave you nothing. And true grace was found in having the courage to share it,